thank you to everybody that's dialed in. Really appreciate you coming along, and welcome again to the this latest Redgate UX meetup. It's part of what we call the Ingeniously Simple brand, which is our kind of community and sort of outreach brand. I think the sort of external facing side of Redgate, so it plays a part in that. And then our Twitter handle is at the bottom there if you would like to tweet anything about what you hear today from the excellent talks that we've got coming up. I'll just click this. The reason for this is I kind of touched on it in that discussion if you were just hearing, and really we just thought that, you know, Redgate takes a lot from the community. You know, we're always trying to learn things from the various people that are out there, and this was an opportunity to just provide a platform to share knowledge and build a community around sort of all aspects of user experience and product design. So our meetups, we try and make them very inclusive, and they're for everybody that's interested in UX, product design, research, strategy, design thinking, and any sort of UX or design challenges or stuff adjacent to that crops up in our kind of daily lives. That's the whole point of that. We're really happy today to have two talks. This is the first time we've ever had two talks, and it's really cool because they're covering both aspects of research and design. So to start, we will have Tricia, who's a senior designer at FutureGov. My understanding is FutureGov is an agency that is sort of on the front line of change in the public sector, sort of digital transformation for government and public sector services. That may or may not be right. Tricia, hopefully you can clarify that in a second if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding of it. So really important work right at the front line of it. And we thought these guys would have a great perspective on that stuff. So first, Tricia will be talking about how to make your user research more strategic. And then we'll go straight into a talk by Ben, the executive director there at FutureGov, about asking design questions. What we'll do then is we hope to get through a couple of talks in about an hour or so. We'll have a quick changeover in the middle if you need a short break or grab a drink, but we won't have a break. We'll more or less go straight across, and then we'll have Q&A afterwards at the end. So if you'd like to, if when Tricia's talking, for example, you want to put any of your questions into the chat, and we'll manage it from there. And other than that, then we'll have half an hour for discussion.
Okay.
Yeah. That section being replaced by wood.
Oh, cool, thank you. Sweet. So you didn't come here to listen to me. That's the wrong slide. You came here to listen to Tricia and Ben. So what I'll do is I'll stop sharing and pass over to you, Tricia, and take it away if that's okay.
Cool. Let me start sharing my screen. Hopefully this all works. Okay. You see that? Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Cool. So good. Great. So I'm Trisha Lee. I've been in UX for about a decade now, currently a senior design researcher with FutureGov. As Chris mentioned, I'll probably leave the FutureGov spiel for Ben. He's been with the company much, much longer than I have. But yeah, I think what Chris said is pretty simple, straightforward overview of what we do. Previously, I've worked in private and public sector, in contract and perm roles, in large and small organizations internationally. Yeah, and I have 2 guinea pigs. You can see. So my talk is around how to make research more strategic, and I was wondering if anyone have ever experienced some of these things, which is research is only seen as evaluative, which means like testing designs or testing an idea. Or if you've experienced that the research you do is focused on a very specific problem, that could seem quite narrow at times. Your research seems to be reacting in the moment to a problem rather than you have a sight of what's coming up in the pipeline. You're doing a lot of work, but you're not sure if what you're doing and the insights you're getting from users are used in decision making. And generally, you feel like what you do is disconnected from the wider business decisions and goals. So if you have experienced any of those, I have too. And I have experienced these in a few places I've worked in both small and large organizations. So I've worked as a contractor at Google, permanent at JP Morgan, and in a small company in the US called Medulla, which is an agency in health IT. And I've experienced these things there. Even though these places are very different in terms of sizes and where research sat in the organization, like what department it was in and how big the team was in that I was part of, what they all had in common was that the problems I experienced as a researcher there were very similar. And the problem that I experienced in these places and others as well is that research in design is not always utilized to the fullest potential. And it doesn't have impact on the business and ultimately users to the full extent that I think it could have. So this is a problem, or at least a problem for me as the lone researcher or researcher as part of a bigger team for a few reasons. But the main one is that at the business level, if research is not influencing how decisions are made, then basically decisions are made based on internal assumptions, which may or may not be aligned with what users need. But at a personal level, I found that this was a problem for me because it made me question if my work had an impact, and this further impacts on personal morale and motivation. And as a result, I've seen, in different places I've worked, lots of people have left organizations or change teams because of not getting this meaningful work or impact from their research. But what I did was I believe that research, there are opportunities for it to do more and to be more. So I try to come back to that every time I feel like there isn't impact happening. And I think that being strategic isn't just about doing a particular kind of research method, but it's a general way of thinking and acting. So to be strategic as a researcher, it involves making connections between our work and the wider business. So we need to step back a bit sometimes. So there are probably lots and lots of tactics and ways that research can be strategic. And there are certainly blogs and books about the topic. I haven't read all of them, but what I wanted to share today was just one approach that I took in these 3 different organizations I called up before, where I worked at. And the approach itself is quite simple, I think, and it's something that we already do a lot as researchers, but it's the thinking around it and the framing of the method I'm going to talk about that I've experienced positions research more strategically. So this is simply a strategic approach to research synthesis. I applied this during my time at Google, JP Morgan, and Medulin. And for this talk, I reflected on how I did this and broke down it into 7 steps I took at these places. So just to go through the 7 steps, the first one is about starting by understanding the overarching business objectives. So when I say objectives, I mean not only what the company publishes online in their yearly strategy reports, but also I would take time to get general awareness of the hard decisions that the business has to make. This could involve different teams like products, delivery, and tech, or even leadership decisions. And there are different ways I would try to get this understanding. So I would look for reports available online. So sometimes those reports can be a lot of pages and can seem quite boring, but they're really important to read to really get into the details of what the business cares about. I'll also look at different product roadmaps or any other roadmaps that might impact on users and on research. You can even conduct stakeholder interviews. So speaking to, again, like product people or anybody else who you think can give you an overview of what's important to the business and what decisions are being made. Or simply you can just get to know others in your organization that are doing similar work to you, that are also focusing on users, and build relationships over time with them. So some teams I try to maintain relationships with, depending on the organization, is market researchers, data analysts, customer service, etc. So in essence, as researchers, we need to act more strategically by getting involved and making an effort to understand the wider business issues and needs. Then the second step, once I've done that, closely related to this is really identifying who do I want to influence. So thinking strategically, I think about if I want to have an impact on the product roadmap, then look, identify the different product managers, for example. Other groups I might want to influence is probably the design team, depending on how that's positioned in the organization. In some places it's separate from research. Tech, or for example, at Google, it was very tech-led. So technical team was a very important one for me to influence. And the others listed here as well. In other places I've worked, for example, at JP Morgan, the research I did could directly influence senior leadership team. So I would focus on their needs and what kind of decisions they were making. At Medulin, the agency, my aim was to influence the client and how they invest in the product further. So this is basically like the users of your synthesis or your strategic work. Then the other step is simply gathering all user data, which is something we have a lot of as researchers. So once you know the kind of impact that matters to the business and the people you want to influence, start collecting data. Just make sure you have access to all the relevant types of data that you need. Don't ignore any type of data. In terms of research data, I would look at reports from previous research rounds I've done. I would even go back to raw data if I need to, in case I didn't capture something in the past. I would look at data from other researchers in the team as well. And also I look beyond user research data. So data from other teams and other departments. So it might be useful to look at analytics, customer service, calls that they get and feedback they get from customers as well. I also found it quite interesting as well to look at user feedback that no one else in my team might be looking at. So online reviews of apps, for example, is something I've looked at Google for the AdSense product. And the more data we have and the variety of data sources that can back up our points, the stronger message we can make to the business, and the harder it'll be for them to ignore it. So one thing I like to do when I get data, before I start analyzing it, is to also surface how much exposure research has had with users. Because for qual research, the sample size are usually quite small, but over time, it can really highlight that we spent a lot of time getting to know a variety of users deeply. So for example, you can see like in that screenshot there, it's really tiny, but when I added up the research we'd done for 6 months, we spoke to actually 384 participants. Okay, and then next step, identify themes. So this probably doesn't need any explanation. This is something we do in research day in, day out in every research project. It's similar to affinity mapping you do in the analysis phase of every study. But this is essentially research on research data for this particular method. And you can really get rich insights at this point when you find data that supports your themes that cut across data sources. So for example, I found a theme that high churn happened in the first time user experience of an app. And this was supported with data from user interviews I'd done, but also from drop-off data analytics from app analytics, and also quotes that came up from interviews with sales reps that someone else had done. And sometimes to kind of package the themes nicely, it might make sense to pull out a single overarching theme across your synthesis. So example, the statement in blue was one overarching recommendation that I made to the business about thinking about the customer experience more holistically across marketing, across comms, across design and research. And then I broke that down into more granular recommendations. Okay, and then the next step. So sometimes in research studies, we do the analysis, we do the affinity mapping, we get themes, and it might be enough to stop there for a particular project. But for this, thinking strategically means that we now need to map this back to what the business objectives are. So everyone that we present this back to, they would have in their minds this main question of, so what? So what does this mean for me? So to be more strategic at a product and business level, we need to think about it from their shoes. And when making business decisions, the audiences we're representing to will generally care about minimizing risk and maximizing opportunities. So once we have the themes from affinity mapping, it'll be helpful to think more deeply about which of these are potential risks that we need to call out and opportunities for the business and why. You can also think about the themes and what they mean for each group that they're going to present back to. So what does the themes mean for the design team? What does it mean for the product team? Great, and then the next step, you have your insights, you have your recommendations, it's time to think about communication. So what I've found is that I've done all this work, gathered all the data, thought through it, to finite detail, but this point could still be a sticking point for in the process. Even after all that work and all the valuable insights, it's still possible to fail if you don't get communication right. So what I've learned, as I mentioned before, put myself in the shoes of my audience and my users. Focus on the outcome I want to achieve, which is influencing these different people in the business, whether it's leadership or product, to make a user-centered decision. And even if this means stripping back my results to just show the basic insights, that's what I need to do. So for example, for some groups in your organizations or different places I've worked, some places they value more detailed reports. And this was the case in banking when I was there in that particular place. So I had a detailed report that I would point a team to. However, in other places I've worked at, they just wanted short and simple bullet points outlining the insights and recommendations. If they saw a lot of text, they would switch off. So I had to be flexible with how I presented the insights, depending on the culture I was in. However, I think regardless of the group or the organization, what's important is to think creatively about how you present your insights, recommendations to the business, especially for strategic work, because especially in COVID, we're all overwhelmed with a lot of meetings, a lot of documents. So I would try to use videos, for example, to kind of highlight the key points. And what I also found useful is to create different versions of my presentation for different types of meetings. So I would have like a snapshot version for a 10-minute time slot. I might get in a company-wide show and tell, but I might have a 45-minute presentation that is more visual for the design team. Cool, and finally, the last step is to evangelize your results. So again, sharing isn't enough. Just the once, you need to keep sharing over and over again. Okay, and then it's what I find useful here. What I've done is try to utilize existing meetings rather than putting new meetings, which can be hard to find time in calendars. So again, coming back to the initial point of getting involved, get involved in existing show and tells, to show what you've done there, but also you can set up specific meetings with the different groups to tailor the messages to products and to design and different audiences. In the past, I've done what I call a roadshow by just walking different groups through the insights and recommendations as well. So that's just tailoring the insights to them. but it's also important to store all the deliverables as you would in other research projects in a central place. It's accessible. So if you give a snapshot, you can point people to where the video recordings are and where the full reports are later on. And part of this sharing and evangelizing is also collect feedback. So this is really important because then you'll know if this method works at all for the company and the context you're in, and how it could be improved for next time. Cool. So that was my really quick summary of the 7 steps I've taken to apply a strategic research synthesis in 3 different places. And I've found that to be one way to kind of position research more strategically. The approach itself is really simple and it's something we do a lot already as researchers. It's just about the thinking and the framing of the method that makes it strategic. So what was the outcome of all of that in the places I've done this? So I've experienced a couple of good outcomes. So here are some listed. But essentially, there's challenges I stated at the start of the presentation about research being reactive and not being involved in conversations. These things started to happen slowly. So it's not a quick fix that happens overnight, but it's a good starting point to show that you have taken the time to align your insights and recommendations and look at the problem from the business perspective and to show where you can add value. So what I experienced is that slowly perception started to shift about research, started to have an impact slowly as well. And ultimately, the impact was designing better products for users. There are a couple of other things I learned along the way in doing this, that if I were to do this again, which I might in my current client at FutureGov, I would do these things differently. So the biggest barrier I found was that it's really hard to go back to data a couple of months after you've done the work, or to go back to somebody else's research after they've left or after they've done it. So the main thing I've learned is to schedule time for reflection in my research process. And this is beside the time I would spend to analyze, to meet objectives for a project. This is just general reflections, looking at the business objectives and my particular project. So for example, if I'm doing 2-week sprints, I would just take an hour or so at the end of my deliverable to think about my insights and if they map to any wider business problems I'm aware of. Another thing I would do differently is probably create a space for reflections. So one thing I have tried actually is a journal, which I find comes to me naturally. So it's just a Word document. I type up my thoughts on it after every rounds of research I do. And that helps me to kind of trigger my thoughts when I come back to this a couple of months later. One thing I did mention, but I have done the synthesis, I found it'd be helpful to do it at the end of a quarter, so it informs the work for the quarter coming up. Cool. And most importantly, be proactive. I've found that no one's going to ask me to do this because it probably isn't something they've thought about or seen, so I just do it and let the value prove itself, and do it little and often. Cool. I'm not sure about the time, but that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thank you, Trisha. That was great. Lots of great tips in there. Lots I agree with and things like that. So yeah, awesome stuff. That's really good. Cool. Well, we'll go straight to. We got some questions coming in, but we'll go straight to Ben for now, and then yeah, do the questions at the end. So thanks so much for that. Much appreciated. If you're there, Ben.
Yeah, I'm here. Let me just try and share my screen.
Cool.
Hope this will work. That working okay for everyone?
Yeah, sorry, was on mute.
Brilliant. Okay, excellent. Yeah, fantastic to be here at the end of what's probably a long day for everybody on a Wednesday, but always great to be part of these meetups, and fantastic that they've kept going as well. So yeah, good to be part of virtual UX Redgate in Cambridge. I'm sure we've got people here from all over. So yeah, hello to you wherever you are. So to introduce myself, we're on a pets theme tonight. So this is our puppy who's 7 months old. When she was 5 months old, so she's big is the conclusion to that, but and getting bigger. But that's what I do in my spare time. I'm an executive director at FutureGov. Chris introduced FutureGov really beautifully before. Like, we work in the public sector to help deliver change and transformation. As you can imagine, we've never been busier in the last kind of 20 months with the pandemic response and supporting the public sector. My background, I've worked in design for just over 20 years now, started in graphic design, moved into digital design, UX design, product, then service design. And really the last 8 years, I've been kind of doing design leadership roles, mostly in government. So I worked for the government digital service for a year. I was then head of design at the Department for Work and Pensions, or as part of what was called DWP Digital. And then I've been at FutureGov now for just over 4 years. I should say as well, I live in Cumbria up in Kendal. So I'm at the other end of the country right now. My previous life, I seem to spend most of it on trains all over the place. So I've been enjoying being up here in the countryside for the last year or so when I can. So today, I'm really hoping to talk about this idea of design questions, which is really something I've been exploring for most of the last 10 years, really, when I look back. It always really starts with this. So a lot of my job really these days is talking to organizations about why design is a good idea. Like, why should you invest in design teams, in designers, and like, what is design actually good for? And I kind of break it down to a number of things, and hopefully these themes will come through today as well. Like, the first thing is really framing, so the idea of how we really like focus the problem that we're trying to solve. And I'll talk a bit about how we center problems around real user experience, real user need, what actually needs to happen, and how we deliver the right outcomes for people. The other thing design's really important for is visualizing. Really, it's how we communicate ideas, it's how we communicate concepts, opportunities, it's how we show things and bring people together to work on things. It's why I think UX designers, service designers, like all sorts of designers, love making maps, love visualizing artifacts. It's really a process of understanding, of bringing together constraints, bringing together conversations in a meaningful way. The next one is creativity, or creating. So it's actually how we make things happen. So that can be approaches to research. So it's fantastic to hear Tricia's talk before on strategic research, and I see design and research as being really intertwined in that way, in terms of we have to find a process to work with people, to learn from people, to really explore, bring ideas together in a way that we can solve problems in new ways, to create value and deliver more impact. And then it's connecting. So that's really how we connect problems, connect ideas. It's solving whole problems for users. It's understanding that a lot of what we do is about relationships within whole systems if we really want to deliver a better outcome for people. It's learning by doing, and I'll talk a bit about that later, but like, design is something that it's a doing thing. It's not really just a thinking thing. It has to be about doing something. It's a response. And it's continuous. So really it's about keeping going. It's a continuous process of actually, can we improve this? And I'll talk about that as well. So really, like, this talk comes from this question, and I'm sure you've seen this question if you're on Twitter, or if you go to meetups like this and have gone to the kind of hung out in the bar afterwards in the past and had drinks in the office. Like, this is the sort of debate that we have as designers. Like, is everyone a designer? And I guess my take on this is that, like, most of design is actually a combination of people working together. And there's always been this big debate of, you know, how does design really happen? And I think the reality for me is that most products and services are actually the work or the result of decisions of people that you wouldn't always call designers. They're business people, they're operational teams, technology people. And like, it's an interesting debate, because if you have followed this, like, you'll know, hopefully you'll have heard of people like Jared Spools, a really famous UX guy. About every kind of 3 months, he basically starts this debate again, and it kicks off. And like he says that everybody is a designer, like everybody can be a designer because they've got the chance to influence a design, and that's really important. Whenever he does that, like cue lots of blog posts like this saying that he's wrong and disagreeing with him vehemently, and then other people saying, actually, like, get over it, everybody is a designer. Like, this is Daniel Burker, who's like well known as the guy for design sprints, if you've seen the Google Ventures design sprints or been involved with those in the past. But actually, Jared Spall, like in this particular blog post, highlights one of the things he said. Like, if you take a company like Netflix, actually the user experience of Netflix is actually really dependent on the performance engineers, about how well that UI performs, how quickly it reacts. If you think the amount of information and visual information on the screen that has to be constant that you scroll through, and it's the same with a website. If a website is slow to load, it becomes a terrible experience. So engineering matters to user experience in that respect. And really, I think I'm not here just for this debate, but I think really any of the decisions that we make that determine user experience and what happens or what the outcome is, really we have to start to think about that as design. So to reframe it slightly, like what I'd say is that we don't need to win or lose this argument. What we really need to do is find a better way to think about this. And for me, it's this, that it doesn't matter really if everyone's a designer, because everybody can actually ask design questions. So that's really what I'd like to explore today. And it doesn't matter, like you could be a product manager, you could be a graphic designer, but you could also be, and this is kind of where FutureGov's work sits, you could be a social worker, a community volunteer. But the way that you're deliberate about improving a situation or intentional about making a change that actually really leads to a better impact, a better outcome for somebody, that's design. It influences what happens. And to all the design specialists, I always say at this point, like, we still love you, but it really doesn't matter, because hopefully we all just care about making good design happen, whatever it is that we're working on. So this is just a definition really of a design question. So for me, this idea of a design question is really about constraints. So really about, like, how do we introduce focus and create shared understanding? And like I said before, no matter what we do, the shared goal has to be, as designers, as researchers, it's just good design, good outcomes, good quality design, good experiences, you know, moving away from things that break essentially badly for people in their lives. So really quickly, a bit of context. Like I mentioned before, I was the head of design at the Department for Work and Pensions. This is a design team meeting in about 2015. And I went in there with kind of 3 or 4 designers to start with, and ended up leading and growing this team. And it was this huge organization of 70,000 staff, about my estimate at the time. Really big portfolio, technology-based portfolio of work, like more than one transformation program, lots and lots of commissioning of new digital services at the time, and a growing design team, as you can see. The problem really was that like just trying to really understand the work that was happening. So like my first design question, I went into this job was really just like, in a lot of the places where we were being asked to put designers, put researchers, like, why are we actually here in this place working with this team or doing this work? And how do we actually know in this large organization that we're working on the right things and we're making a difference? Like, are we focused in the right way? Like, starting to question that. And I had to kind of find a way to tackle that. And I ended up kind of using these 5 questions that I've got here on this slide. And I actually shared these, what is now 6 years ago, on a blog post. And what's really interesting, that I thought nothing at the time of kind of sharing these on a blog post, but it's actually turned out to be the most shared blog post and the kind of most interested in people have ever been in anything I've written, even though really it's these simple kind of design questions that I was asking teams at the time. And like, just to run you through a high level, like, again, it was the kind of, why are we doing this work? Like, what's the reason for this particular discovery or this particular product that we've been asked to work on? Like, who are our users? Like, who do we actually think is going to need to use this product or service or this digital kind of solution that we're now building? What outcome are they going to get from the service? So that's really like asking and being really deliberate and saying, like, what problem is this going to solve for people? And then in the balance as well, there's always the problem in 2 hands, in that not only is there a user need, but actually if we look at the context of the organization, what is this intended to do in terms of the business need or the organization need, which quite often a lot of work in government was being commissioned around things like cost savings, the need to move people to digital by default services. So that the idea of channel shift, getting people to self-serve and do things online. And with all of that in mind as well, like if we do all of these things, like how are we going to measure against these types of outcomes? So what are our key metrics? So I really found really early on actually that those 5 questions worked really well. And essentially that I spent about probably the next 3 years, most of the time up until I joined FutureGov in 2017, 2018, still using this format. And like this is the FutureGov version of the same poster. But we used it a lot in workshops. So you can take one question at a time, really practically. You can ask a group or individuals to do one thing per post-it note or post-it notes on Miro boards now. And then we would affinity sort, and we would really, it's about getting a group of people to a shared understanding of why are we here, who are we building this for, what need do we really actually understand together that this is going to meet if we get it right, what are the assumptions that we're making, and how are we really going to measure progress. And what was great, like I've got kind of examples of this now that are nice. It kind of went all over the world as well. This is Latvia in 2015, if you remember traveling outside the UK, which feels like a distant memory now. I think this is the world's biggest 5 questions workshop. This is my world record, a particularly big workshop. But all we were really doing, and this is why I was so kind of blown away by the interest in this blog post when we shared these 5 questions, it's all about really using design to add context and understand constraints. And quite often, like the team I was kind of responsible for at the time were being asked to solve product problems like digital solutions, digital transformation, moving parts of services online. And just as part of GovUK and government strategy at the time, that was the ask, that was what was needed. But the real opportunity with all the work we do, and this is a big part of FutureGov's work, is always about the context. It's really about how you reframe and what's possible within that context. So if we take a product, like quite often really a product is the digital solution, or it's the tool we're building, or it's the thing that helps somebody to do something. It's a point of interaction. It might be a task or somebody achieving a specific goal at that point in a kind of journey. But actually we can then ask the question, what is the service? So actually normally around every product, there's a service that is supporting people in a real life situation or scenario to do something as well. And that is a combination of online, offline support leading to an outcome. So we can think about what is this bigger thing that's happening. And then actually, if you really want to kind of broaden that out, not only can you think about service, you can think about system. So as soon as we start thinking about systems, we're thinking about the interdependencies that work and function together. And quite often, like we work, and a lot of FutureGov work is in areas like housing, education, social care, health. Like these are all systems that actually have like a complex kind of network of organizations, different parts of government that work together in order that actually something changes in a positive way in somebody's life, in a place, in a single postcode. But actually, like you open up these systems and you can work the other way backwards. You open up a system and actually you find people interacting and organizations interacting, you find services, you find products. To give you one example, like I mentioned some of the areas we work in, like if you took housing, like the product we might get asked to work on is actually like just the council website needs you need to configure a form so people can actually apply to join the housing register. Like that feels like a simple kind of piece of product delivery. But actually the service and the real opportunity is there's a whole council team providing advice and trying to prevent homelessness, supporting families with situations like emergency accommodation. And they publish advice, guidance, they have online advice, they have offline advice, they have walk-in centres. There's a whole set of things happening connected to this transaction and this digital product. And then if you really open it up again, if you lift the lid on that, it's part of the national housing system and policy. So, there's all sorts of national policies around homelessness, regional strategies, and all of this also depends on multi-agency partnerships, organizations working together. And the point is like good design can actually make all levels and all parts of these systems, services and products better. And being able to make that connection is really important. It's all about that context if we really want to deliver better outcomes. I thought I'd give you an example. It's a bit unfair to pick on them, but this is where I live. Like, if you, like, this is sort of where we are still in local government, and there's a lot of work to do. Like, if you're at risk of becoming homeless in the town where I live, this is the website and the content you have to try and decipher in order to get support. As you can see, like, it's not accessible, it's not clear, it's not easy to navigate, and it should be better. And again, this is why I work doing public sector design. Like, just even the basics of signposting people in a really urgent situation need to and should be better. I mentioned maps before, so like, this is a nice example, and you won't be able to see the detail on this, which is on purpose, but this is a piece for Hounslow Council that we did. It was led by Alex Torrance, who's one of our senior designers at FutureGov. This is a system map, and it shows the different agencies involved around vulnerable children and pupil care. And it's all the data collected in terms of just how, essentially, like, how are vulnerable children and families supported through the system to make sure they're not at risk. Really important set of services run by a local council. And what we're really doing here, like Alex building this map and working with the team, is really questioning. Like, I wanted to show you the sheer kind of scale of a system view, but actually the important thing is that ability to understand the relationships within here as part of schools and children's services. And the mapping and the understanding is really important. And as I've already said, really, the map is the thing that creates the conversations. So a good map starts to show us these product service system relationships and the user needs that we've been exploring, and we can question those as well, like I showed you before. Yeah, and for me, like, the question is always, like, where are we in the map as we ask those questions? Where is our perspective? And what kind of questions can we ask from there? I really like maps as well, because most of us are kind of familiar with maps in terms of post-it notes and the idea of kind of these blocks sitting one after the other. But actually, the spaces in between things are usually actually what's possible. Like, they're the things that are undefined. They're often the points of failure where there's gaps in between things in that experience, any kind of experience map. And it's understanding. And I almost think it's kind of like a lot of what happens is defined by what doesn't happen. Actually, like, I learned when I was studying graphic design 20 plus years ago now, we learned about the importance of white space defining, like, how well a design works in terms of what you communicate. And it's the same in experience design or service design. The white space, the space in between things, actually defines the success of the things that we more intentionally designed, and we have to think about that balance. So really quickly as well, so because I want to make time for questions, questioning in terms of design questions is about new perspective. I mentioned user needs, and really just to think about this more, like, user needs don't have to just be practical things. Like, it doesn't have to be just the transactional things on a website like gov.uk. Really, it can be about how we understand relationships and different types of needs, about life events. And I just wanted to show you this example. This is work I did at DWP again. But really, it's the difference between different types of user needs. And I've written about this if you're interested in kind of reading and getting into it further. But a lot of the time, we're understanding the relationship between more emotive or emotional needs, things like really planned and unplanned events, the things that are happening in our lives, like the need to plan towards retirement, like suffering a bereavement, being at risk of losing your home. Like, these are all kind of like really big life events that kind of hit us, and sometimes planned, quite often unplanned, and they're things we have to deal with. They're things where that relationship with the public sector actually comes to the forefront, and we need support from somewhere. And then within that, there's really practical needs, the things that people have to do. And quite often that's really where we focus on user needs through digital. And like, the example I used to give actually at DWP is that finding a job, like, DWP is obviously, it's about employment, it's about welfare support if you lose a job. Like, finding a job is really practical. It's a practical thing. There are tasks you can do to search for work, apply for work. But the fear of actually getting sick, losing your job, the risk of losing your home, not being able to support your family, the reassurance you might need, the support you might need around that, just to get to those sets of practical needs that might get you out of that situation with the right support. That's emotive, it's emotional. And we have to question the relationship between that if we want to deliver something that's truly better and much more tailored and, you know, personal in terms of what people experience and how well that outcome actually turns out for them in the end. There's some really, I mentioned this before, but there's some really nice examples of kind of understanding emotional needs. I love this quote I took from Matt Edgar, who's now a transformation director at NHSX. He's previously head of design at NHS Digital, so he's been a big part of the development of digital and design and user-centered design in health over the last few years. But it's this idea that instead of accepting just a system, actually we can really prise it open, like I said before, lifting the lid, but revealing the human needs and choices that actually create and sustain it, and actually really questioning, being prepared to zoom in. Like I said, I'd kind of share some examples, but emotional needs for me are really things like this. And you can find these kind of lovely stories, but in these really like terrible situations. Like this is a child on her way to theatre in a children's hospital for like quite a major operation. But Aberdeen Children's Hospital, they tweeted this a couple of years ago, that they bought this electric car so children can drive themselves to theatre, just to kind of like distract them and provide some level of experience, you know, just something else that's positive in really what is a terrifying situation for them. If you imagine like being kind of 6 or 7 and having to go through that. And I love the fact that like they didn't have to do this, like on a practical kind of need level, it doesn't need to happen, but actually meeting the emotional need in this situation in healthcare is really, really important. There's another good example, and this is a lovely book by Dr. Rachel Clark, who you might have seen has been really a bit of a spokesperson throughout the COVID pandemic for the NHS. But in her book, there's an example of how quite a lot of hospitals, they have children's play specialists for this reason. And they've done this work, this example of work in Royal Marsden, and it's about how they've tackled the fears and anxieties of children facing radiotherapy for cancer. And when children go in for radiotherapy, they can't be with their parents, they can't hold the hand of like their loved one, their mum or dad can't be there. So they design this, this system where they've got a ball of multicolored string, and they basically give one end of this ball of string to the child in radiotherapy, and they run the ball of string out of the theatre room all the way through to where the parents are sitting, and they hold the other end of the string. And there's something really meaningful about that connection. So the child knows that their parent or their mum or dad or the carer, they're at the other end and they're there. And again, it doesn't need to happen, but there's something significant about understanding the emotional need of that situation and meeting that as part of the care that's being delivered, as well as obviously the practical thing of delivering radiotherapy as part of cancer treatment. And I think like you can say, obviously this is health, but I think we can think about this and apply this everywhere. There's an emotional element to having to actually deal with practical things in our lives. Like we are all emotive in terms of how we live our lives, the relationships we have, how we feel and think about things. It's important that we think about emotional and practical needs. So I've shared my kind of 5 original design questions. And when I've kind of developed this talk over the last few months, I really wanted to think about kind of what other design questions, you know, 6 years later, should we maybe now be asking? And I've got kind of 4 or 5 areas just to talk you through, which I think are kind of where I think design is kind of pointing us, and where design again can really add value. Like why should people care about design in terms of how it's used in their organizations? So I think areas where we probably need better design questions. So number 1, direction. And number 2, like thinking about impact. And I've talked about impact a bit so far. Inclusion and exclusion in the work we do is really, really important. And I'll come back to that. I've mentioned already breakpoints, or where things break, the idea of kind of white space defining kind of the success of what actually is designed and happens. And this idea of design doing. So let me go into a bit more detail on some of those. So in terms of direction, really like the design question here, and I'll share these slides if people are interested in using some of these. Like the idea of like, what's design good for? Well, framing, like being able to actually add value by saying we can center a problem around real user experience. But it's this question of whatever the product, service or change, what is it that we're really working towards? How ambitious are we in terms of where we can be in the future? And vision for me, like setting out a vision or an end goal, is really being able to describe an ideal future state. and being more radical and being prepared to actually create the alternative. I think that's where design is important. There's probably, like, the COVID pandemic's been interesting to reflect on in terms of design and the way the public sector has responded, because actually what we've seen is actually an acceleration of change and the ability for things to change during COVID. This isn't quite an old example now, but we've seen lots of town centres, lots of city centres kind of use the pandemic and the changes in how people are traveling, how people are using bikes, taking exercise, all the things like where we were shutting streets really quickly to make room for cycling. Like councils are being much more radical with their planning. Like, we're seeing this roll back a bit now, but we're still seeing like a much more radical kind of action in terms of the response. And now increasingly, as we kind of say, actually, well, what is our kind of future response to things like the climate crisis going to be? But it's a design question. It's being willing to imagine the alternative and also to make that a radical alternative. So the next question that I would ask now is really about impact. And impact kind of goes beyond those initial design questions to how is this product, the service, or the change we're working on, how is it, again, like local places really being experienced in the places and with the people it's impacting? And really, this is the idea, and we think about this a lot at FutureGov, the idea of like hyper-local links, bringing back that experience, that outcome to really like, what do people experience in a place? What is the difference between Bristol or Cambridge or Kendal in Cumbria, where I am now, or, you know, in an inner city part of London? How do people really experience this? And I think the only way we can really get closer to that is real experiences, is through things like research. So really building on what Tricia was sharing earlier about being strategic with how we use research to increase the reach of the work that we do, work with hard to reach communities, you know, and hard to reach groups in terms of our products. Like, I've talked about maps a bit, but I kind of love Google Maps, and I've used this example for years because we have this ability on Google Maps to zoom in and out. And if you use Google Maps a lot, you'll probably know about Street View, where you zoom right in from satellite and you keep going and you keep going and you keep going. And eventually, if you do it, you get to Street View, and like there's usually some people kind of hanging around from when the Google camera went past. And I sort of like this because when you zoom out enough, you lose that view of the people. You've got a map, but it's not really close enough to really understanding how people actually navigate their way around the city, how people use the streets, you know, where people are likely to be and how they're likely to act in this situation. And I think design is very kind of like, it's almost multi-directional to that extent. Like, it's never only really what happens here, it's the perspective we take in terms of being able to zoom in and say, okay, well, how do we understand really how is design experienced here, even if we're designing over here? And our own perspective is never going to be the same, even with as much research as we can do, is really going and spending time with those communities and those places. So like, a good design question is really like, who is this actually going to help? Like, how close are we to their real experience? How quickly will they actually feel that change? So that's impact. And then as well, like I've talked about kind of closer to communities, but that really leads on to the idea of design questions about inclusion and exclusion. So I think more and more, like, this is coming to the forefront as we kind of tackle some of these questions at a societal level. Like, I think everything we work on, we have to be more honest with ourselves about saying, like, who is excluded by this solution, or who doesn't it reach? And obviously, working in public sector design, we have to really ask that question and be very honest about that. Like, sometimes, like, making the transactional parts of government kind of faster, cheaper, simpler by moving them online hasn't always been at the benefit of reaching some of our hardest, you know, to reach communities, those that are excluded in society, those that don't have access to even basic digital tools or information, you know, who aren't online. And I think we have to really think hard about, you know, who is currently outside of the reach of what we're working on. You know, who haven't we built trust with that's going to help them to essentially benefit from these services that we're developing? And we have to look at that very carefully. And it's actually really, it's an opportunity to design things that work better for everyone. I really love this example that if you've not seen, like I'm sure a lot of you have, there's a film and there's a series of films actually by Gary Ewart. The first one of which is a film called Objectified. It's about, it's basically a series of films about design and the importance of design. I think the oldest one's maybe 10 years old now. But in it, it's got this example of the OXO Good Grip kitchen tool and how this has become a symbol really of like how product can be designed to work for everybody really well. And this is just a quote from the film, but if you're not familiar with it, these are two potato peelers. The one at the bottom is the sort of thing you might find in your grandparents' drawer kind of 40 years ago. It's quite hard to grip and it's made of metal. And basically the original project was done to see like, could they create a grip that would be good for people with arthritis, people that would struggle to hold on. And it's now like, if you've got pans and stuff in your kitchen, they probably all have grips a bit like the one on the top compared to the one on the bottom. And really a lot of the time, and the idea is that by focusing on this kind of outlier, the extreme, that by looking at kind of people that were at a disadvantage, that actually didn't, things didn't work for them, we've actually created a product and they've been able to design a product that works better for everybody. And that's really, for me, a really universal principle of good design. Like other examples, there's lots of examples, like the cordless kettle was designed for people with limited mobility. It was designed for kind of safety for people that had limited mobility, so it'd be more flexible, but actually of course it's better for everybody. So quite often the design question I think here as well is really like, where is the potential to say like, where are outliers in this system we're designing for? Where do people sit outside? Who is excluded? Who is disadvantaged in the context of the work we're doing? Who doesn't this work for now? And then maybe actually if we're strategic with our research again, if we look at those people, if we say actually, well, how can we design something that works for them? And then if we reverse that, actually, maybe we've designed something that actually works better for everybody. So again, a use of design questions, but really it's almost like flipping the logic. So instead of designing for an average user, we design almost for single users, for outliers, for extremes. So we're always looking for those extremes, but really it's about reach, it's about inclusion, it's about making sure that things do generally work for everybody in society. And then the next one, just to build on that as well. So if I go backwards, yes. Oh, just one more example, actually. Sorry, I meant to include this as well. This is a vaccination bus. So really current example, and it's a vaccination bus on a BBC News report visiting Elswick, which is, like as the BBC reported, is an area in Newcastle which traditionally and historically has got health inequalities and like quite a high level of poverty. And part of our vaccination strategy, which I think most people would accept has been relatively successful in the UK compared to some of the other kind of COVID response. Part of the vaccination strategy has been to actually really target harder to reach groups, people that haven't accessed the vaccination program by going to a GP, by going to a vaccination centre. And this is a perfect example, like what the government have been doing, working, but it's all through community leaders at a local level, is taking this bus into local areas with community leaders and reaching people that way so they can get vaccinated on the bus. So you take the service to people that are hard to reach, not the other way around. And that's really how actually local authorities have had to work much harder to reach harder to reach groups. You can get to 60 or 70% of people, but actually there will always be that group that you have to design for differently. And I think that's actually a really great example of that. So last couple of points and then I'll stop. But next one is just this idea of breakpoints. And the design question here is really just what will happen if and when this thing that we're working on breaks. And I think if you've worked on enough kind of products or services or done enough UX design or research, you'll know that everything breaks at some point. It's just a case of like how it breaks. And quite often like breakpoints, we think about screen size, layout, how services work when they don't work for people. And I just think there's so many examples of this. I left this in because I quite like the idea of like a lot of tech innovation. We sort of say, fail fast and break things. But like Elon Musk and Tesla have been doing solar roof panels. So they've been making basically solar slate panels, so tiles for roofs. And there's now a slightly famous story that's done the rounds that basically the majority of people who bought these tiles, they were too heavy for their house roofs. So they were making the houses structurally unsound because the tiles are too heavy, because nobody really thought to question the weight of the solution and the innovation that they were putting in place. So quite often, like, it's just like somebody didn't ask a simple question at some point, or really question something enough. So now they're having to actually like do structural work, rebuild roofs to actually these tiles work in certain circumstances. And there's lots of other examples as well. Like, this is another one that should be funny if it wasn't kind of so sad in a way. Like it was really well intentioned. If you like, earlier in the year, the Duke of Edinburgh sadly died, as you'll know, and the National Rail Inquiries website decided to change their website design to black and white as a mark of respect. If you heard about this at the time, it obviously made the site totally inaccessible for like thousands of people who use it every day and rely on it. And again, this is really just the example of there was nobody probably with accessibility needs in the office when that change was being made that thought to question it. In the same way that quite often, you know, if we don't have diverse teams, we don't question design decisions in a way that actually they might be adversely affecting people with different needs, different circumstances, who are part of different communities and, you know, in different situations in their lives. And we have to be really kind of, again, intentional about how we question things. And then just a final couple of examples as well. Like, again, this is almost like I could smile about this now, but I moved house in December and I had to order a new dryer because the one we had didn't, a tumble dryer, because we needed one for the new house. On the left is my order confirmation, which I screenshotted on the website of a certain large utility company that is on the high street. What I found is a week later, it didn't turn up. And I also found that they shut their customer service line, which meant you couldn't ring anybody about it. And I couldn't find any way of getting support. And the website didn't recognize my order number. There was just nothing I could do. So I was basically in this kind of no man's land. The service had broken and there was really no clear way of resolving the issue. And I had no idea whether I bought a tumble dryer or not. And like, this is like, it's a first world problem, you know, I could cope, but this happens all the time. Like, when these websites work okay and the delivery arrives, it's fine. But actually in the end, I found there was a live chat. And after a long wait, I spoke to somebody who confirmed that actually they didn't have my order on the system. It hadn't gone through for some reason. And even though I had a pending payment on my bank account, that they hadn't taken any money from me. And it was just this kind of really messy, confusing experience where in the end, I went and bought a tumble dryer from somewhere else and I was an unhappy customer. But like, I've got probably like at least 10 years of examples like this of where reasonably well thought out UX, you know, especially in theory, kind of looks good and works well 80-90% of the time. But when it breaks like this, when a small thing goes wrong, when a system doesn't share data, when a system loses data, when a phone line shut down because maybe staff aren't available because of COVID and they've had to change their operational model, actually you start to see customer experience and outcomes slipping away. And for me, just like, if you'd spent a week with this as a designer, you could question these things, you could do research, you'd be able to fix these things in a way that you would retain customers, that you would guarantee better outcomes and actually build a better business. And then really, this is my final example in the talk. This is my GP surgery. They use this thing called Ask My GP. And it took me ages to work this out because you have to book an appointment online now, which is pretty normal. Like, a lot of people have got the NHS app as well now. But when you go on this, it basically, quite often I was going on and it just kept saying that the practice was unavailable for online requests. And I couldn't work out, like, why is it never available? And there's no phone line on here. There's no website link. There's really like no information. And in the end, I worked out, it took me about 3 weeks of like trying to book an appointment, that basically they switch off the service out of office hours. So it's only if you go on this app between 9 and 5 that actually the link works to book an appointment. And there's nothing telling you this. And like, you know, again, fine, it wasn't a serious situation. But what if I'd gone on this because of like, I thought like my daughter had COVID or something really serious, like, all it really needs is like a link to NHS 111 that's there after 5 o'clock. You know, that ideally, like, why not just leave it on 24/7? But if it's about maybe demand management, like, why not have at least like, you can have a message on there saying ring 999 in an emergency? Because what if it was an emergency? And again, design questioning is really saying, you know, questioning like what could happen in this situation, rather than just like, these are just the assumptions of a developer, I'm guessing, about, you know, what content to put on a screen at the point where, you know, the service isn't switched on. So like I said, like, questioning is always really about being prepared to understand context, real situations, what's happening. And as I've kind of set out at the beginning, my final point is really about this idea of design being something that you do. It's about the ongoing process of creating value through learning by doing and making things real. And I'd even go as far as to say, actually, it's only really design if something actually happens, if you're able to actually provoke some more learning, to provoke a change, to change what people experience. Otherwise, it's really just theory. So just kind of like this process of questioning for doing, like, again, I think you can ask really simple questions. So every time you make something, you prototype something, even if it's like, you know, system level, service level, whatever you're kind of creating or wherever you're trying to kind of influence change, you can be intentional. So a bit like the examples I've just shown you, like, you can ask, how could this work? Given the understanding of what's really happening, what people are experiencing, like, what could change? How could it work better? And I think the process of building, the process of designing is really just this constant questioning of like, what if I tried it this way? What if we did this? It's the idea that I love, the idea of kind of prototyping is aggressive tinkering, really. We're taking these small steps, questioning, making this adjustment, that adjustment, seeing what works, responding to that feedback. And again, prototyping really quickly, I could do whole talks on prototyping. It could be lightweight, it could be quick, it could be iterative. It can also be real code. It can be getting, like we've seen in COVID, actually, like through FutureGov's work, we've seen whole services launched in like 3 or 4 days around things like helping people express interest for like building ventilators. We involved with that as part of the group that we're part of, the government's response. So it can be building whole services, learning and iterating and committing to scaling those services in the right way. I really like architecture. It's kind of where my interest in design came from. And again, just to kind of leave you with an analogy, like I think we can think of design questioning, but we can also think of design as modeling. Like, quite often I talk about this idea of less service design and more service models. So what is the model in terms of how things work and how people experience and access services as part of systems? And design is really this process of not service models, but service modeling. So really we're building with the materials we have, like we work in code if it's digital, and we question each decision. We make models, we evaluate each model, we build things at different scales. We work with them, we learn from them. And actually, I think architecture, if you ever looked at kind of scale models of architecture, like this is, like I was fortunate, I went to New York just before kind of COVID hit, and this is from MoMA in February 2020. And it's a Frank Lloyd Wright building, which is, you can see the scale there from the person kind of stood in the background. But like, architects learn from creating models of the world that they want to create. And I think design is the same. Whatever we're building, whether it's a digital interaction, whether it's the way that a team works in a local council, we can prototype that, we can learn from it, we can build scale models. And questions, and the questions we ask of the models we build, are really a tool that helps us to experiment. It's a tool that helps us to, you know, questions are a tool that helps us to build and explore how things work at those different types of scale. And then my real final point, this is my absolute final point. So hopefully, like you probably all know, like I get a bit kind of, in a way, frustrated with like how much we get drawn into these how might we questions. Like they seem to be like the design technique everyone uses now. Like we frame it as like, how might we address this problem? And that's fine as a technique. But I think there's a balance as well. And I think the most pressing question we can ask, in terms of like, we're probably all working, everybody on this call today be working on different types of things, private sector, public sector. But there's a question of like, are we really the best people to solve this problem? Or at least, are we the best people to solve this problem on our own? And if that's the case, like who is best placed or who's better placed, and how can we work with them? How can we bring people into the work? How can we create those hyper-local links? And I think it's really essential, really, that, and this is, I think, where design should be in 2021 in terms of what our design teams look like, how diverse our design teams are, how well they represent and work with the people that we're designing for, and also for the people we're designing alongside, for their ideas really to be the ideas that we work with as well as our own. So I think we can't pretend that we're all smart enough, unbiased enough, or in the best place to have all the best possible answers in terms of what could happen. And actually asking design questions is our opportunity and our responsibility to make better design happening by really opening up the reach of our work, connecting our work in, being less precious about who solves the problem, and really just caring about how the best possible design happens. So instead of how might we, it's really why are we? And that feels like the biggest question going forward, and who else can we bring into that? So I've talked really fast because I always do, and it's the end of a long day, but I really hope some of that's been useful. I just want to say FutureGov, like, we're always growing and building the team. If you want to check out our work or you're interested in working with us, you'll find us at wearefuturegov.com. And really big thanks as well to Chris and the Redgate team for inviting myself and Tricia to tonight's event. I would say as well, like, check out their work and their UX team and opportunities if you're watching the video back. And yeah, like, all of the work we do matters, design matters. We need more design in our organizations. So if you're watching this and you're interested in design, please feel free to get in contact with any of the team. And yeah, we'll be happy to kind of share opportunities and hopefully help build the impact of design and the importance of design, both in the public sector and beyond. But thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Ben. Mind blown, which is weird because it's mind blown by the simple questions we should all be asking all the time anyway, right? It's like amazing. Well, to start with, I'll just say, like, nice, like, I'm a real firm believer in, like, important, meaningful work like this. And, you know, we work in databases and it's not quite the same because this is where we are, but I'm glad this work is being done, and from what I heard today, I'm glad you pair are doing it, basically, because it's like, yeah, it's like important. If you want to make a start on the Norwich City parking permit workflow, feel free, because that's a circular labyrinth of nonsense. That's really excellent. I think the thing that's really, I love all the mapping. I love the look for it in the gaps. I'm a big comic book fan, and it's what happens in the gaps in the same way. It's what happens between the panels that's important, right? And how you understand what happens in the story. And I think I apply that to UX, and I think that really resonates. But amazing. I think we got a few questions. I think Tricia, you've answered a couple already, but does any, I mean, I've got plenty of questions, but I'm never going to get through them in 12 minutes. So I'll put it out to the audience if anybody's got anything that they'd like to ask. Unless there is any in the talk that we've missed, in the chat, sorry. Vaughan? Have I said that right? Are you still here, Vaughan?
Yes, I am. I'm actually walking along the sidewalk, but yeah, thanks. Those were really interesting. My background is more academic. My background's in social theory, social change, and behavioral science. And so I'm really enthused to see people sort of taking these ideas and applying them, because, as you know, in an academic context, they're not often applied. So I'm very excited to learn more about this field. My comment was really to do with impact, and coming from the sort of academic background, social theory and so on, there's been a debate going on for literally decades as to the sort of distinction between emotional impact and practical impact, and which one should take priority, if any, and then also how these two things interact. So in the second speaker, what's his name? Ben, I forget. It was the second speaker. Yep. So in Ben's talk, I found it very interesting when he was pointing out that there's sort of emotional impact that might be sought, and there's design around emotional design, if I could put it that way, as well as sort of practical design. And that immediately made me think of this dichotomy in social theory that's been in debate for decades, a very important distinction between those two polarities, and where should we focus our attempts to make change. So in a design context, should we design for emotional impact? Should we design for emotional appeal? And will that lead to sort of practical changes that users themselves would undertake? Or should we design more towards practical impact, and that would then impact on the emotional, if you follow what I mean? So,
yeah.
you know, is there a distinction between the two? How does the one impact on the other? It'd be interesting to sort of hear a little bit more about how Ben has encountered these, if at all. I realize my question's fairly philosophical, perhaps.
That's a good question, and I feel like I should have done my talk walking now, because it looks much cooler than sat in my home office. Yeah, next time. Yeah, I think it's kind of like you said it yourself. I mean, the opportunity is the link between the two things. Like, and for me, it's less of which is the right of approach, and it's more the opportunity of really understanding the link between how people feel, kind of experiences, and what's happening, and this, you know, experience the situations they're in. That I use the children's kind of care in hospital situations, and you know, there's a practical level of care that has to happen. It has to happen in the right way, and clinical pathways have to be designed in the right way. But in terms of like meeting people's emotional needs as part of that is essential to, actually, it's proven in terms of academic research, to better health outcomes as well, in terms of how quickly people recover in their emotional state. And you know, these two things are connected. And I think the opportunity is always, for me, if we've got a very practical set of needs, like we need to, you know, we're building something very transactional, we're helping somebody to you know, accomplish a very kind of defined task or outcome that feels kind of more practical. There's always a context, like, can we open that up to understanding, like, what is the, you know, how does this, I used to say this in UX work years ago, like, how, you know, what, not only what are people doing and thinking, what are they feeling? How do we make that connection back to how this change or this particular event, this life event, is being felt? And I think that context, that understanding, helps us to actually design the practical steps in a more meaningful way, because it might just be about some reassurance, some the points where we reassure people. I've done a lot of work in government, without sort of naming one example, where actually the point where you notify somebody about something really matters, in terms of them worrying about it or being anxious about it. If it's, you know, getting support to be a carer and a payment they're waiting for, like, when, if you don't notify people within a couple of days of an application, that really is quite emotive. Whereas actually, you know, you could tell people straight away, and there is research you could do that says actually maybe we need to be sending people weekly updates until there's money in their account. And, you know, like, we don't, sometimes there's kind of everything that you don't have to do, but quite often, really, the ability for services to reach further and really improve the outcomes and the situations in people's lives, yeah, means we need to connect the two. And impact is really just about what happens. It's the result of kind of one thing affecting another thing. And, you know, we're all experiencing change. Like, COVID is a perfect example of global change that we're all experiencing individually in our lives, in a place, and collectively as well. And like, the public sector has a role in shaping how that impact is felt through the work that we do. But I don't feel we can attach the emotional impact of that, and how we've all felt that change, and the impact on our family and friends and individual situations and things like mental health, as well as the practical things of, like, a lot of, you know, FutureGov have been doing work. We've been helping with, you know, building systems to distribute food and medicine through voluntary community organizations really quickly through councils. Really practical stuff, but at an emotive level, like, we're all going through this experience. And it's really about, like, what kind of society you're building together as well, if you it's the real potential of this work.
Thanks a lot, Ben. That's a great answer. Appreciate it.
Cool, thanks, Vaughan. I was just about to ask you Hazel's question, Tricia, but you've answered that in the comments just now. So if you'd, that's cool. So if you'd like to read the response to Hazel's question, which was about keeping research going once the initial sort of momentum has faded out, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think Hazel left, but it's just being recorded.
Yeah,
my thoughts on that is, in the discussions when you're sharing your research, as you might do in smaller projects for this one as well, discuss next steps and capture it. So it's not just left out an open-ended question about now what. That's particularly easier if you're presenting the work into smaller groups. So if you're tailoring your message to the product team, for example, you can have a more richer conversation around next steps with them. So that's an argument for like a roadshow approach rather than just a big kind of presentation. But also I think it's just a matter of time. Just keep understanding the problems and the decisions that are being made in a business and linking back to your insights over time.
Sweet, awesome, thank you. And Tim has been asking a couple of questions. Tim, would you like to speak, or are you happy for us to read it out? It'd be nice to hear it from you as it's quite, just so I don't get it.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I just wanted to say is in relation to some of this stuff, I've been thinking a little bit about change management, the relevance of change management, because ultimately coming up with the ideal design is one thing, or service design or product design, whatever, but actually getting it implemented involves change management. And that, in my mind at least, kind of also relates to kind of thinking strategically. And I was wondered what either of you thought about that.
Yeah, we could probably both go for this one. Shall I go first, Tricia?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Hi, Tim, by the way. Nice to see you.
Hello. Yeah.
Tim's one of our FutureGov associates, I should say.
He's a plant. He's a plant in the audience.
Loaded question. Yeah. There's a payment at the end of this. Yeah, like for me, the importance of like clear vision, like being able to describe potential kind of future state is really important, because quite often change management is actually the ability to work backwards from there rather than work forwards towards something. Mm-hmm. So quite often we get trapped otherwise in kind of incremental, it's easy to go from A to B to C, but actually you might reach a limit quite quickly. Whereas quite often, like setting out, actually design sprints uses this that I mentioned earlier. Like if you know what the ideal end state is, change management is the process of saying, well, what are the reasons why actually, what are the roadblocks that stop us from getting there? And change management is the process of managing and dealing with those things. And there'll be all sorts of constraints that make that model of the world impossible at the moment. But design is usually really the process of believing that, I've just been writing about this today, actually, anything can change essentially anything's possible if something changes. So we've seen kind of the public sector delivery during COVID, the pace of delivery, the impact of delivery has gone beyond anything people thought possible in some areas of government, because there was a major change in the conditions that surrounded that, and it was COVID. But quite often, what we're doing through change management is we're understanding things within a system that we can change or affect that allow that bigger set of possibilities to be realized. But you've got to really understand what you're working towards, or have that ambition to be able to start to set out or understand what is it that we need to change, what is it we need to manage, what are I like roadblocks, because quite often we talk about roadmaps. So we have a roadmap that says we want to get to here, we have that vision, but actually what are the things we have to navigate, and we can prioritize, we can work backwards through those to make sure that we're able to manage in a way that that future version of the world can exist. And then there's the ability to also understand as we go as well. We'll probably learn stuff that helps us imagine something even better, because the first, that initial vision is probably not quite right. And again, that's agile delivery, that's design, it's learning, it's constant questioning, and involving people, in terms of in that process. So it's, understanding that our ideas will probably break at some point and there'll be better ones. So yeah, I think change management, obviously a big part of kind of how we work at FutureGov, as kind of Tim knows, but I think you've got to have that as part, like it's part of design process. But again, consultants are also doing design. It's really important to say, like, again, it's not exclusive to designers.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on, Tricia.
Yeah, not much to add to that. That was such a good answer. The only thing that came to mind is obviously from a research perspective, like Tim is, it's about ensuring that research has a seat at our table when those decisions are made and when change is happening. Yeah, so just gather your data and kind of surface it, in the right conversations to the right people.
Cool, thank you.
one brief question. We are running at the time, and I appreciate everybody's had a long day. I've just got one brief question, Tricia, because one of the aims that I've got in my role is to help engineers think more strategically when it comes to research. Our engineers are really good at getting on research calls. They're really engaged, and they're very exposed to research. But they're more used to tackling like usability testing and things like that, and they sometimes find it difficult to connect the dots of strategic research with, can I sit down after this call and make something that helps? There's that kind of thing. They deal in, how can I build the thing that solves this problem? And the strategic stuff's a bit further ahead of that. I think it ties in somewhat, Ben, with your emotional goals and those emotional needs that you're trying to do, right? Because you understand in the context in which the user sits and things like that. And it's just, I wondered, across all the places you work, Tricia, is there any places where you've managed, like, how have you instilled that kind of strategic thinking about the bigger picture with engineers?
One thing that comes to mind is bringing users to life, for engineers, not just engineers, but just, we're all in offices. Well, we used to be in offices, now we're home, but we can be so disconnected from the actual users, just bringing that to life. So it's not just about going from research to research and finding to finding, it's about making the actual end users real. And that could be using different tools, like whether you use personas or archetypes or user needs. It's a powerful tool that we use at FutureGov and through our public sector. So those things kind of frame your thinking to kind of come back to. It's like a tool you can always refer back to. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
I'd add as well, really quickly, when I worked for Government Digital Service, one of the most powerful things that they kind of introduced back in 2013, I think it was the idea of everybody in the organization goes and watches user research. So at least 2 hours every 6 weeks, from like the CEO down to like the product managers and including the engineers. So the team I was a designer and a researcher in at the time, like we literally went as a team to the lab every 2 weeks. And a lot of it was usability testing. We were in beta and we were testing a lot of like forms and digital interactions at the time. But, we had engineers in the room. But what was really powerful is we were also spending some time before those. We were bringing in real people who would use the service, but we were also just talking to them through the mirrored glass and having conversations, and people were really getting a bit of a window into people's lives and the context and how things felt, as well as seeing them kind of, struggle to use a form input, which we go away and obviously fix those things. But that context really helped people understand. And I think it changes how you react. It is kind of building that empathy that helps people to make different decisions and a kind of shared level of shared understanding in the team that's important. And, also bringing those people into research synthesis after that as well. So you're deciding how to respond together.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Okay, we're coming over time. I've just got a couple of slides, only a couple, and we'll leave it there. Tim, Natalie, sorry, if I'm not sure whether you're Natalia Anderson or Natalie Anderson, so apologies for that, but she's added some further comments to your things. I've just got a couple of quick slides. Thanks so much again, Ben and Tricia, much appreciated. Just to wrap up, let me try and share my screen. It's just literally clicked into dark mode, and that's just knocked me off a bit of what's going on and where things are. Oh, it's already there, but why can't I share that? Everything looks the same, that's the problem. 1 second, sorry. I am also a bit of a Luddite when it comes to this. So yeah, cool, there we go. And then the Zoom thing. So just some final, oh no, that's the wrong share menu, present. I do work in things. We had some questions, so that's cool. We are always looking for speakers, so if anybody in your business or yourself or anybody else is up for talking about it, as I mentioned at the top of the thing, we're always looking for people to discuss, the whole thing. It covers the whole remit of UX and design, so and we're particularly interested in hearing from first timers and giving first timers and underrepresented communities a chance. So just reach out to us either on Twitter or on Meetup, and yep, we'll start a conversation. You can follow us, as I mentioned earlier. We have this Ingeniously Simple brand, and we've got sort of different content across all different things. So we do have our own Medium blog. We've got a Redgate product development Twitter as well. There's a bit on Instagram, probably not too much, but all the talks will be on YouTube as well. So if you're interested in delving into any of the other talks that we've had across the time, and these Trisha's and Ben's talks will be on there within about a week or so. And we also have a podcast on Spotify if you're interested in checking out some different perspectives from within us. The next event is already live, which is, as I touched upon, Divya's and Mandar's organizational skills early. So we're speaking to, he'll be speaking, Ioannis Nousis, who's an interaction designer at Google, and he's going to be talking about how to maximize the value of any MVPs you create by using the riskiest assumptions. So that's on the 6th of October from 6 till 7. So it'd be great if you sign up for that. And yeah, follow us again. And that's the end of it.